I never planned to survive the war. And I never planned to write this. This account exists for one reason only: silence is heavier than guilt. And I have carried both longer than any prison term history could invent. If you are reading these words, then the final order, to erase everything, has failed. My name is irrelevant. Names are for graves and monuments. I left neither. In the winter of 1944, I held the rank of General Major. On paper, I commanded nothing. In reality, I was entrusted with something that officially never existed: an armored reserve detached from every recognized army group. A unit without insignia, without records, without a future. We operated between lines and ledgers. Orders were spoken once, never written. Rail schedules were altered overnight. Fuel requisitions appeared and vanished. When clerks asked questions, their signatures disappeared from the books soon after. Curiosity, in wartime, was a dangerous habit. Our strength was precise: 58 Panther tanks. Fresh from the assembly halls. Engines untouched by combat. Barrels still smooth, unmarred by fire. Engineers called them masterpieces, machines balanced perfectly between elegance and violence. I saw them as numbers waiting to be reduced. They arrived at a forest clearing near the borderlands just before dawn. Pine needles snapped under their tracks. Exhaust drifted low through the trees like ground fog. Steel giants standing silently, as if listening. The crews gathered nearby, boys with rifles too heavy for their shoulders, veterans with eyes already emptied by loss. Some had been salvaged from destroyed divisions. Others had not yet learned the mathematics of survival. I studied them the way an accountant studies a ledger, calculating what would remain when the columns returned. If they returned. The mission had no designation. No code name. No file. It existed as a single directive, delivered once in a locked room and never spoken again. We were to advance through a corridor deliberately omitted from Allied maps, a stretch of marshland cut by an abandoned industrial road, and used since the early years of the war. Reconnaissance photos were sealed away. Air support was denied without explanation. If we succeeded, we would rip open a wound deep behind enemy lines and choke their supply arteries. If we failed, there would be nothing to explain, because officially, we had never been there. I signed the orders myself, knowing no historian would ever trace my pen. I authorized fuel diversions stolen from other dying fronts. Numbers never lie. They only accuse. 58 Panthers. 90 hours. 3 days and 3 nights to strike, withdraw, and vanish back into the margins of the war. The first night was unnaturally quiet. Engines hummed low as the columns rolled forward under a sky without a moon. No radio chatter. Only the sound of metal, mud, and inevitability. And as we crossed the invisible line where maps ended, I realized something with perfect clarity. No one would come looking for us. By the second hour, I knew time itself had abandoned us. There was no sense of movement through history, only the illusion of progress, as if we had slipped between the seconds that maps and reports refused to acknowledge. No distant artillery. No flares tearing open the night. Only the measured grind of steel pressing forward into nothing. At dawn, the forest loosened its grip. Trees thinned. The ground flattened. Wetland stretched ahead, frozen just enough to deceive us. Ice carries confidence until the moment it doesn't. Then the road appeared, cracked, forgotten, but intact enough to invite belief. For a brief, treacherous moment, I allowed hope to surface. I despised myself for it immediately. Hope has always demanded payment in blood. The first tank vanished without heroics. A Panther pitched forward as the ice collapsed beneath it, the front end swallowed in a violent silence. The crew scrambled out, boots sliding, fingers numb, breath fogging in panic. There was no enemy fire. No explosion. Just physics, indifferent and final. Recovery was impossible. We memorized the coordinates and moved on. 57. The second night taught us a harsher lesson. Fire erupted from positions that intelligence insisted were empty. Anti-tank guns, perfectly sighted, expertly concealed, struck with the certainty of those who knew exactly where we would be. One Panther bloomed into flame. Then another. Then another. The dark filled with burning fuel and screaming metal. Radios came alive despite orders. Names. Shouts. Prayers cut short. Smoke clawed at the freezing air as I recorded losses by flashlight, my pencil shaking inside a gloved hand. Each number felt less like a counting and more like a charge read aloud. 54. By the third morning, snow began to fall, thick, deliberate, smothering sound and distance alike. The corridor revealed its true nature. Not a passage, but a funnel. Its walls unseen, its exit imaginary. That was when I understood something far worse than ambush. We were not pushing into enemy territory. We were being erased. The map had not omitted this space by accident. It had been left blank on purpose. And still the Panthers rolled forward, because machines understand momentum better than men understand doubt. 17 tanks were gone before the first 30 hours had expired. I closed my ledger and stared into the white horizon. The arithmetic no longer required a pencil. The subtraction was accelerating. Intention had become irrelevant. This was no longer an operation. It was endurance, measured not in kilometers, but in minutes. The silence inside our command vehicle grew heavier than any bombardment. The crews felt it. In the cold that seeped through steel and cloth. In the pauses between contact. Soldiers are trained to obey orders, but instinct whispers louder when survival begins to look improbable. And the enemy, they were always waiting. Mines appeared on routes labeled clear. Ambushes unfolded where our scouts promised open ground. It became impossible to deny the truth, this mission had never been unsupported. It had been offered. We were not the spear. We were the distraction. The 90-hour window was never a schedule for success. It was an estimate of how long we would last. Tank by tank. Crew by crew. I watched my command dissolve. Faces once hardened by resolve became hollow, drained of expectation. We were phantoms fighting in a place that history had already decided to forget. On the final day, with only a few machines still capable of movement, the radio crackled once more. One word. Withdraw. But by then, there was no direction left that could honestly be called backward. The way behind us had become a cemetery we had built ourselves. Charred hulls. Twisted tracks. Blackened steel still warm with the lives that had occupied it hours earlier. There was no retreat left, only evidence. The way forward promised nothing but extinction. We had failed. Not because we lacked courage, training, or resolve. We failed because failure was the condition of our existence. The unit itself was a deception, and our destruction was meant to conclude it neatly, without witnesses. I issued my final order. Disperse. Break formation. Survive if you can. It violated every principle I had been taught. Command exists to impose order, not abandon it. But continuing would have meant slaughter by instruction. This was the last authority I had left to exercise. That I lived at all feels like a clerical error. I walked for days through frozen fields and shattered villages, driven by exhaustion and something colder than fear, anger stripped of emotion. Somewhere along the way, I abandoned rank, identity, and allegiance. I became another nameless figure drifting through the ruins of Europe, indistinguishable from the millions history would never catalogue. I write this not seeking forgiveness, nor correction of the record. I write because silence, left unchallenged, becomes complicity. 58 Panthers vanished into that corridor. The world moved on. I did not. Their memory is my sentence. Heavier than prison. Permanent. This testimony is the only marker they will ever have, a refusal to let them dissolve into arithmetic. They were not figures on a page. They were men. I was trained to believe that war was geometry. Angles. Calculated sacrifices. Purposeful losses. A game of foresight and control. But the corridor shattered that illusion completely. It was not a board. It was an open wound. As we pushed deeper, the land itself began to betray us. Farmhouses stood abandoned, doors swaying in the wind, tables set for meals that would never be eaten. Animals wandered freely through empty fields, unclaimed, unafraid. Not a single civilian remained. That absence was deliberate. Absence can be engineered. Then the fire intensified without warning. Mortars fell with brutal precision, walking the road in measured intervals. Shockwaves rattled teeth and nerves alike. Our Panthers answered instinctively, cannons roaring, trees erupting into splinters and smoke. Through my binoculars, I watched a tank commander rise cautiously from his hatch. A single shot folded him where he stood. No drama. No struggle. Just a body collapsing as if it had lost interest in standing. We kept moving. We had to. Stopping meant erasure. Withdrawal had been forbidden, phrased not as an order, but as an inevitability. I had obeyed such language before. This one felt different, as if written by someone already absolved of consequence. By the 48th hour, the enemy was no longer our only adversary. Transmissions failed. Gearboxes seized. Fuel pumps clogged with impurities that should never have passed inspection. Spare parts never arrived, because officially, there was nothing to supply. My crews stripped disabled tanks under fire, hands bleeding, tools freezing to skin. Panthers were reduced to donors for their still-living brothers. What had begun as a formation became a wounded herd, cornered and thinning by the hour. Patterns emerged from the chaos. Enemy units appeared precisely where the route narrowed. Artillery adjusted before we maneuvered. Every decision we made was anticipated. Our encryption was either compromised, or the truth was far worse. The corridor itself had been offered. I confronted the liaison officer, a thin man whose spectacles were always clouded with frost. He neither denied nor confirmed anything. Orders had come from above, he said quietly. Above clearance. Above whom, he did not say. In war, ambiguity is protection. The third night brought freezing rain, undoing winter's grip and turning the ground into a sucking, merciless mire. Panthers bogged down, engines screaming against earth that refused them. And then the sky answered. Aircraft appeared overhead, flares descending slowly, bathing the corridor in a sterile, merciless white. Shadows scattered in every direction. For the first time, I understood completely. This was not an operation gone wrong. It was an operation completed. My men, what remained of them, were reduced to shadows sprinting through artificial daylight. When the bombs followed, the earth itself seemed to open, swallowing steel and flesh without distinction. Entire machines disappeared into craters so deep they felt deliberate, as if the ground had been prepared in advance. At some point, I stopped counting the dead. The mind has limits. Mine reached them. I began counting what still existed instead. Each surviving Panther became a mark in my notebook, a final attempt to impose order on annihilation. 31 by the 60th hour. 26 by the 72nd. Then higher command fell silent. Whether the radios failed, the enemy interfered, or the connection was severed on purpose, I cannot say. What I can say is this: the silence did not feel accidental. It felt like a door being closed slowly, carefully, from the outside. In that vacuum, a final transmission arrived, short-range, encrypted, undeniable. We were to continue advancing until the 90-hour limit. Assets were no longer relevant. There would be no reinforcement. No recovery. The language was not motivational. It was terminal. And with that, clarity arrived. Our mission had never been measured in ground gained or objectives seized. We were meant to absorb attention. To pull fire. To exist loudly, briefly, and then disappear. A phantom formation, constructed from men and machines, intended to be expended without record. By the 84th hour, 9 Panthers still moved under their own power. Their crews functioned on reflex alone. Faces hollowed. Movement stripped of urgency or hope. I gathered them in the remains of a village square, stone walls shredded by shrapnel, a church tower collapsed into rubble that no longer resembled faith. I told them what truth I could still carry. That survival now required disobedience. That recognition would never come. That history had already decided not to remember us. Some nodded. Others stared through me, already gone. Under cover of darkness, we broke into smaller elements and abandoned the last of our heavy equipment. I ordered the remaining Panthers destroyed. The detonations rolled through the valley like distant thunder, an ending without witnesses. An elite force erased by calculation, not defeat. I escaped with a handful of men, moving across frozen ground guided by instinct rather than direction. Behind us, snow erased our tracks. The corridor reclaimed itself. By the 90-hour mark, 58 Panthers and the men who crewed them no longer existed in any official sense. The numbers were final. Weeks later, I surfaced in a city reduced to skeletal ruins. I reported in as ordered. The office was intact. The faces inside it were not. A clerk processed my return without once meeting my eyes, stamping forms that documented nothing of substance. That was when the truth became undeniable. The corridor was absent from their maps. My unit was absent from their records. The operation had already been resolved, by omission. The debriefings were theater. Questions danced around logistics and anomalies, never touching the reality of what we had endured. I answered carefully. Too much honesty would have been reframed as failure. Or worse, defiance. Each omission felt like burying another man. Among the surviving officers, rumors circulated quietly, stories of secret maneuvers, of sacrifices enabling some unseen success elsewhere. Some clung to the idea that our destruction had delayed an offensive, or saved another front. There was never evidence. Belief, I learned, was optional. And preferred absent. The men who escaped with me were reassigned one by one, scattered across collapsing fronts. I never saw most of them again. Their names dissolved into administrative categories, their service absorbed into totals and footnotes. When I asked about them, carefully, discreetly, I was advised to focus on my current responsibilities. That, too, was an order. Forgetting was never an option. Sleep offered no mercy. It became another battlefield. Each night, the corridor rebuilt itself behind my eyelids. Every return was harsher than the last. I woke tasting smoke that wasn't there, my hands cramped into fists, muscles locked as if I were still bracing for impact. The quiet hours before dawn crushed me more completely than any barrage ever had. As the war staggered toward its end, a quieter operation began. Erasure. Documents vanished by design. I watched from an upper window as files were fed into courtyard fires, page after page curling into blackened fragments. Ash rose into the air like a diseased snowfall. And I recognized what was burning. Serial numbers. Fuel authorizations. Routing codes. My handwriting. The corridor was being destroyed, not physically, but conceptually. Its coordinates reduced to smoke. Its existence dissolved beyond recovery. After the surrender, I was questioned. Thoroughly. Carefully. The interrogators were patient men, trained to extract truth. Yet whenever my testimony approached certain stretches of time, their curiosity evaporated. When I finally spoke of the Panthers, of my unit, they paused. They checked their lists. One of them looked up and said, evenly, there is no record of such a formation. You may be mistaken. In that moment, something irreversible occurred. Reality itself was disputed. My memory became the error. I was released soon after, classified as irrelevant. That word cut deeper than any accusation. Irrelevant. Years passed. Flags changed. Archives reopened, selectively. Historians argued over decisive battles using documents already stripped of contradiction. The corridor never appeared in their debates. A blank space no one questioned, because it had never officially existed. But I carried the ledger. Not on paper. In my head. Its pages hold faces, voices, final moments. Sometimes I replay the subtraction. 58-0. The math never shifts. It doesn't bend to politics or convenience. That is when I understood. Secrecy was not a feature of the operation. Secrecy was the operation. Not merely to deceive the enemy, but to erase it from ourselves. From future generations. From conscience. The Panthers were never meant to be remembered. Their disappearance was the intended outcome. This confession exists because I refuse that final order. I do not write for forgiveness. I write to assert reality. Something happened in that corridor. Something measured in hours and lives. Something deliberately removed from the record. The truth did not reveal itself all at once. It surfaced slowly. Painfully. A fragment overheard in a corridor. A memorandum misfiled. A drunken admission from a man who believed the past was buried deeply enough to be harmless. He was wrong. It always mattered. What we endured was not strategy. It was leverage. While armies clashed in public view, negotiations unfolded behind closed doors. They were not trading territory. They were trading demonstrations of obedience. Our obedience. The corridor was the proof. A blood-written assurance. A statement that said, these men are expendable. And they were correct. Except for one thing. I am still here. And silence was never meant to survive me. By destroying an elite formation, those at the summit were speaking in a language older than any doctrine. They were declaring their readiness to pay without limit. Even with lives that would never appear on a balance sheet. Even with losses that would never be acknowledged, documented, or mourned. A price paid not for victory, but for leverage. To preserve deniability, maps were redrawn. Coordinates softened, then erased. Records were cleansed, not to clarify history, but to shield reputations. What vanished was not a mistake. It was protection. We, the Panthers, became currency. A disposable asset exchanged for time, influence, and negotiating room. Our destruction would later be translated into neutral phrases, spoken in quiet rooms long after the smoke had settled and the ground had frozen over the dead. And I was not innocent. Obedience does not erase responsibility. I understood that even then. I saw the projections. I calculated the attrition. The plan was mathematically unsound before the first engine ever turned. Yet I chose execution over refusal. Precision over conscience. That decision, made calmly, professionally, has outlived every explosion. It reverberates louder than artillery because it came from within. A single moment where I surrendered judgment, and in doing so, surrendered men. This story was erased because it revealed something unforgivable. That some operations are never meant to succeed. They are engineered to fail, cleanly, thoroughly, and without witnesses. That anonymity can be weaponized. That a unit can be destroyed not despite its secrecy, but because of it. It proved that silence can be commanded as efficiently as movement. That forgetting can be enforced as doctrine. I leave this testimony without expectation. It may be dismissed. Reframed. Labeled delusion. The confession of a broken officer haunted by imagined corridors. That, too, would complete the design. To discredit the survivor is to finish the erasure. But arithmetic resists interpretation. 58 machines. 90 hours. No acknowledgement. The equation does not argue. It concludes. I record this knowing truth does not require acceptance to exist. It does not demand consensus, only articulation. It needs to be spoken once, clearly, before it is buried again. Even if these words vanish. Even if they are locked away. Even if silence closes over them once more. It happened. We were there. And this is what was done.